question or comment about?
Right here. Just kidding. Sorry. Okay. So I apologize for two things. One, I'm going to read this paper, and two, I'm an academic, so it's a super academic paper, but I'm happy to explain, or answer any questions that you might have, or explain concepts that might be horribly pedantic or nebulous. So I'm just gonna sort of set the theoretical framework for the panel. Again, the title of this panel comes out of my PhD dissertation work, in which I analyzed anti-Blackness and anti-communism as mutually constitutive technologies of domination and subjection, with communism operating as a metonym for all forms of radicalism, including labor militancy, socialism, communism, internationalism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-racism that contravene the pedagogy of the Cold War state. Anti-Blackness can be understood as an instrument of governmentality that confiscates the body and life world of the Black, distorts it for the purposes of accumulation and exploitation, and returns that distortion to the Black as reality. It's a process of violent dispossession that reduces the Black to nigger and to economic, existential, and semantic surplus to be extracted by the state and its institutions. Anti-radicalism is defined as the repression, disciplining, and punishment of individuals, organizations, ideologies, and movements that challenge the exploitation of the working class, that seek to upend private property relations, and that demand the transformative redistribution of wealth and resources. As an intellectual project, anti-radicalism, or what I call intellectual McCarthyism, manifests in the denigration and distortion of Marxism, the marginalization of critical political economy analysis, and the discrediting, sanitizing, or erasure of socialist, communist, and leftist activist intellectuals. This is often facilitated through discourses of culturalism. Starting around 1947, anti-communism became the defining instrumentality of Cold War American domestic and foreign policy. The US state constructed communism and any ideology that intersected with it as the dominant threat to the American world order. The ascendance of the US to international economic, political, and military hegemony inaugurated an official paranoia about the spread of communist influence internationally, and the unprecedented levels of prosperity domestically was haunted by the specter of internal communist subversion and sedition. International campaigns against purported Soviet expansionism, hostility, and imperialism were accompanied by domestic inquisitions against those accused of being communist agents. The legal institutional framework was harnessed to state anxieties about challenges to its authority through Justice Department mandates like the Federal Employee Loyalty Program and the Attorney General's List, congressional committees such as the Subversive Activities Control Board and the House Un-American Activities Committee, and a slew of legislation, including the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938, the Alien Registration Act of 1940, commonly known as the Smith Act, the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, known as the Taft-Hartley Act, and the Internal Security Act of 1950, known as the McCarran Act. The conflation of loyalty and security placed severe economic, legal, and political constraints on Blacks, leftists, and quote-unquote aliens, and citizens deemed susceptible to radicalism. The explicit labeling of opponents of Cold War discipline and surveillance as subversive and communists resulted in the widespread repression of dissident political activities. In Cold War anti-communist culture, discourses of difference were articulated with those of treason. Thus, as Tony Perucci argues, both Blackness and communism became key elements in the semiotics of disloyalty. The Cold War statist technology of anti-communism entrenched the move away from structural and material analysis by criminalizing and punishing opposition to the racialized social order, the spread of empire, and capitalist expansion. One result was that groups of Blacks in the United States, not least Cold War liberals, began to mobilize around cultural specification for inclusion based on liberal civil rights discourse and to assert international linkages based on mutually recognized cultural enunciations of Blackness. This replaced and discredited internationalist challenges to exclusion from the state based on racialized economic dispossession, the maldistribution of resources, and histories of enslavement, colonialism, and other forms of labor conscription. At the same time, decolonizing countries that saw equality in the world system asserted their willingness and ability to adopt the culture of development, modernization, and anti-communism. This was notwithstanding the fact that their insertion into the global political economy as sovereign nations continued relations of unequal exchange, declining terms of trade, and neocolonialism. The devaluing, discrediting, and disciplining of radicalism derives informative value from the subjection of Blackness, and likewise, the multitudinous modes of regulating Blackness in different racial formations is constituted by anxieties about radical insurgency. Thus, Blackness transforms radicalism to a form of subversion that must be suppressed and eradicated, at the same time that radicalism reifies Blackness as always already, antithesis, alterity, and threat to US state and empire. The latter conjuncture has been a feature of US policy and practice from the nation's inception. Historian Gerald Horne argues in his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States, that the American Revolution was a reaction to London's 1772 ruling in Somerset v. Stewart that chattel slavery was unsupported by statute and common law in England and Wales. Although the decision was ambiguous with regard to slavery in the British colonies, settlers in what was to become the United States were fearful that abolition would spread, thereby jeopardizing property and wealth that was fully dependent on plantation slavery, the slave trade, and slave-related industry. Slave trade-related hostilities between Great Britain and the North American colonies dated back to at least 1762, when the British temporarily seized Cuba from the Spanish. The British moved to regulate the slave trade and curtail the number of Africans coming into the New World, while slave traders in the colonies demanded the deregulation of the trade to increase the flow of the enslaved. Moreover, because of the significant number of slave uprisings that were happening throughout the British Empire in the 16th century, white settlers were particularly threatened by the prospect of a critical mass of freed blacks on the mainland and in the Caribbean. Thus, the American Revolution was as much a counter-revolutionary, that is, anti-radical protest against the eradication of slavery in the British Empire, as it was a challenge to monarchical tyranny and domination. The American Revolution, therefore, was directly contingent upon the denial of freedom, equality, and liberty to its enslaved population, and created the conditions for the United States to wrest control of the slave trade from Great Britain. Not only Southern plantation society, but also Northern capital, banking, insurance, and industry were invested in the continuation of slavery and the slave trade, even after its formal abolition in 1808. Thus, the anti-radical character of the American Revolution and its aftermath is inextricable from and imbued with anti-Blackness. By 1798, the new nation's anti-radicalism became codified in the Alien and Sedition Acts. These were meant to manage the threat posed by foreigners, especially politically active radical exiles of the French Revolution, through the deportation of aliens who were deemed a threat to the state, the disenfranchisement of immigrants, and the punishment as treason of any critique of or opposition to the government. More importantly, the passing of the acts was based on fears about the radicalization of the mainland black population as a result of the Haitian Revolution. The flood of white and mulatto immigrants from Haiti and the enslaved Africans that brought with them began to inspire unrest among persons enslaved in the US and among abolitionists. Like the Somerset case 2 decades earlier, the Haitian Revolution threatened the slave system. And like the American Revolution, the Alien and Sedition Acts entangled the suppression of radical dissent with the unfreedom and violent dispossession of the black population. Following Horne, I insist that the aversion to blackness that is endemic in the US state and society is inexorably entangled with the disciplining of radicalism. Thus, the manifold articulations of the Red Scare are made possible by the persistence of the Black Scare. As a technology of domination that discursively produces the black as absolute other, located on the constitutive outside of the state, anti-blackness has provided the template for disciplining those who pose discursive and material challenges to the policy and practice of the US state. Anti-radicalism, as analogy to anti-blackness, derives its meaning from the unbelonging of the black, who is the originary subversive non-citizen. The analogy between blackness and radicalism becomes evident in that, according to Carol Boyce Davies, quote, state monitoring of black movement and migration has been from the outset related to broader fears of racial and ideological subversion in national political cultures, end quote. Insofar as anti-radicalism derives its informative value from the historical deployment of anti-blackness, the radical and the black are entangled as absolute other and anti-American. The socio-ontological structure of the black/radical gives intelligibility to both as alien, deportable subject, and or carceral non-citizen. Davies contends that historically, deportation and incarceration have been the twin ways that the United States has dealt with undesirables. She continues, quote, deportation is an earlier version of the criminalizing and parallel conferring of statelessness on those with political positions deemed radical by the state, end quote. The conferring of statelessness through deportation and/or imprisonment is another instrumentality of violent foreclosure from the state. Its instrument effect is the violation of the Black radical body through the reduction of the latter to the status of abject. In this way, anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism interact through metaphor to mutually inform surveillance, discipline, and punishment, because the entire logic of un-American behavior is linked to U.S. ideologies of capitalism and racism. The co-constitutionality of radicalism and Blackness rests upon the understanding of Blackness as a structural location, or a unique relationship to the mode of production characterized by a special form of oppression. This, of course, is not a new idea. The Black Belt thesis, theorized in 1928, argued this position through the understanding of the Negro question as a national question, that is, that Black Americans were effectively a nation within a nation. It thus contested Marxist orthodoxy that understood race as an epiphenomenon of class exploitation. Instead, persons including Harry Haywood and Claudia Jones insisted that the structural condition of U.S. Blacks was not reducible to that of the exploited white working class and therefore required special attention. According to Haywood, quote, "The stifling effects of the race factor are most strikingly illustrated by the drastic differences in the economic and cultural status of Negroes and whites. Beyond all doubt, the oppression of the Negro, which is the basis of the degradation of the poor whites, is of separate character demanding a special approach," end quote. Jones agreed, quote, "We know that the semi-slavery of the Southern sharecroppers, the inferior status of the Negro people in industry, North and South, the Jim Crow practices of New York and Chicago, as well as Birmingham and Tampa, all can be traced back step by step to the continued existence of an oppressed Negro nation within our borders," end quote. Though he disagreed with the Black Belt thesis, Black communist luminary James Ford nonetheless understood that, quote, "Because of race discrimination, economic distinctions, and cultural hindrances, 13 million Negro citizens occupy the lowest rung in the social life of the United States. In cities with a large Negro population, the Negro people are forced into a ghetto existence. A large portion of the Negro population is concentrated in a special section of the country, the Black Belt of the South. Hope for prosperity and democracy in this section of the country is therefore indissolubly bound up with the future of the American Negro," end quote. Another aspect of this argument was the special exploitation of Black women, theorized by Cyril Briggs and Eugene Gordon as double oppression, and expanded upon by persons including Louise Thompson Patterson and Claudia Jones as triple exploitation, so that Black women are exploited as Blacks, as workers, and as women. To these foundational ideas about the structural location of Blackness can be added the League of Revolutionary Workers concept of niggermation. So this is the idea that speed up in factory and plants, especially car plants, is based on kind of the exploitation of Blacks in particular. Black power theories of Black communities as internal or domestic colonies, and James Boggs' understanding of Black, quote, outcasts, castaways, and cast-offs as the vanguard of the socialist world to come, given their redundancy and degradation in the increasingly automated industrial sector. Building upon these earlier explications, I contend that the structural location of Blackness is constituted by labor super-exploitation, extreme surplus value extraction, regimes of capitalist accumulation and disaccumulation, the absorption of the risks of capital, and racialized use value, which is a materialist version of the psychoanalytical concept of libidinal economy. It is for this reason that the radicalization of the Black serves as the ultimate threat to capitalist economic, social, and race relations. In other words, as a quintessential threat of subversion and destabilization. I'll end with the following statement from Richard Wright in 1960. So he stated, quote, "The Western world must make up its mind as to whether it hates colored people more than it hates communists, or does it hate communists more than it hates colored people," end quote. This quote brilliantly articulates the structuring aporia, that is, the irresolvable contradiction that haunts the U.S. capitalist state. Thank you.
Excellent. So now on to Olufemi Taiwo, please.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to talk about basically is what is the working class? What should we think that is? And I basically got on this subject by disagreeing with kind of three segments of people that I saw talking about the working class, or maybe even just using the term working class. So the first category of these people are like your neoliberals or liberals, people who might use the term working class but don't seem to me to really be talking about it. And when they use the term, it seems like they don't mean what we might mean, which is people who have a certain relationship to capitalism. They have a kind of social description in mind. So actually, the New York Times ran this like little, one of those social media little quizzes that you could take. And it would ask you like how many times you ate at Applebee's. And that was, that was supposed to be a measure of whether or not you were working class, which was like real cute. So that's one group, right? Then you have, then you have like the white left in the US, or maybe the global north in general, who want to use kind of what Marx meant by the working class. And I'll probably respond to that most directly. But then a third group of people are people who, maybe the left of color in the US, or like the hip millennial left of color, who want to use the term working class and want like what's good about that analysis, but also want to integrate some of the different ways of talking about politics and oppression that are fashionable now. So terms like privilege or intersectionality or complicity and oppression, those ways of thinking, all of which I think are onto something, but I think we would have different things to say about those terms and the ideas that they're talking about if we were more thorough in trying to figure out what this has to do with capitalism, what this has to do with colonialism, and all that good shit. So finally, so those are the three people that got me onto this. So of course, I read a bunch of people, one of whom was Marx. And Carl says this, the wage relation at bottom is a contract. It's a contract to exchange hours of your life for dollars or whatever the currency is. And the working class is the people that reproduce themselves, the people that stick around, that stay alive by making this kind of contract. That's the basic idea. And I'm just trying to work through a different way of thinking about it. And the motivation for thinking about it differently is something like this. Maybe we should think the essential political relationship to capitalism is between people in this whole thing that results from capital, this whole empire that results from capital, not the particular relationship between this worker and this employer, or even relationships of that kind. And I think, an important reason to think about that sort of thing is just that there was an outside to capitalism for much of its history. It's easy to, capitalism is everywhere now, but it's everywhere now because groups of people conquered their way to it being everywhere now. So the kind of thing we might say reflexively now that, global production is decided by, CMC prime, that kind of thing. That would have been news to the Kikuyu or the Igbo, like as soon as, as recently as like the 19th century, right? So that's the basic idea. So how do we think differently about what the working class is, how we're going to define it? So I'm going to start by just returning to like the sort of thing Marx says about the working class and just working through it a little slower. So the relationship it's a social relationship that embodies it in material relationships, which is I produce widgets, the act of me producing widgets creates value. My employer, Jeff Bezos, claims the value is his, and the rest of the world acts as though he's right? So that's step one, right? There's things called commodities, which happen because of that process. And we're in a world where commodities are necessary to material security. So probably no one needs to build, no one needs to build like Xboxes, but people need to do that kind of thing. People need to produce stuff so that we can all stay around, because some of the things we produce are things like food and water and shelter. And if you ask why anyone's doing the particular thing that they're doing, they're not going to say, well, I really think the world needs lattes, and that's why I work at this coffee shop. They're going to say something like, I need to pay rent, I'm taking care of, my kids are in childcare, that's expensive, I'm taking care of a parent, something like that. They're going to give you those kinds of answers. Well, how did we end up in this situation if we weren't always there? Well, that's the story about primitive accumulation. So at one point, you know, people were in whatever different form of social organization they were in, and they, you know, cooked up plantain and, you know, drank from the river, and it was all fine, and then someone with guns told them they couldn't do that anymore, right? And so not only were they intimidated off of having this relationship today, but they were intimidated out of the kinds of things that would allow them to start it again tomorrow. So nobody taught me how to farm. I wouldn't know what to do if I were, you know, just given a bunch of seeds and a plot of land. And that's not an accident. It has something to do with the first thing I said about guns and colonialism, right? So then you get people who are alienated from securing themselves, from making sure that they're going to be alive tomorrow in all the regular ways. And so they have to do this weird thing, which is trading hours of their life to a capitalist. So that's why we have a working class, and that's why Marx describes it the way that he does, as this contract between people with hours of their life to trade and people with dollars to trade. But here are a bunch of problems with characterizing the working class in those terms, either in Marx's time or our time. I mean, functionally, the kind of person that we were often thinking of in this situation was a European person, usually men. There were some aspects of the economy as Marx found it that weren't gender segregation, weren't gender segregated, but many were. And it's not because of, you know, some privilege in some general sense, but it's because there were specific laws and specific policies and specific cultural norms that prevented, you know, that being different. And, you know, more strikingly, there were a bunch of people, you know, if the wage relation is a contract, there were a bunch of people who weren't in a position to make contracts, people who were enslaved in chattel slavery. So whatever relationship their work had to the system, it wasn't the kind that the wage relation describes. And you can get similar kinds of worries going on if you think about colonialism and the kinds of labor that goes on there. If you have a contract with your employer, but your employer isn't subject to any of the laws of the place where you live, then, you know, how is that the same as being a waged worker in Liverpool? It's not. And I think, you know, these are all classic points. There's back and forth about them, but I want to talk about a different way of thinking about what's going on with work under capitalism that Amilcar Cabral offers us. So he describes both colonialism and capitalism as, you know, ultimately a form of cultural domination. And he means cultural domination as a kind of material domination. He doesn't mean cultural in, you know, they tell us our songs aren't good, and we think they are good, right? So who's Cabral? Cabral was a organizer and military actor in the anti-colonial struggle against the fascist mother country of Portugal. The place where he was from is called Cape Verde, which was completely a chain of islands off the western coast of Africa, which was completely unpopulated until the Portuguese began trading massive amounts of African people in the 15th century. And for much of the time where this transatlantic slave trade was operating, it was used to Latinize slaves. So it was used to culturally break them and remake them in a way that made them suitable for slavery. So it's kind of interesting that Cabral ends up saying what he does about colonialism and history and culture. And what he says is that Colonialism basically is the situation where you can't explain what's happening in your life, you can't explain what you're doing by reference to your own culture or your own history or your own values. You have to explain it by reference to someone else's. That's the basic material relationship of colonialism. And when it's just put in those terms, it can sound like it has the flavor of this kind of anthropological capitalism. We used to do these dances, but the slave masters came, and now we do these other dances. But that's not what he means. He means, how is your life organized in general? And whose history explains that? If it turned out that the reason why the people on your island produce what they do and die in famines, as they often did in his time, isn't because of how much food there is or isn't on the island, but is because of what the Portuguese want to get out of your island. This is the kind of way that you begin to think about culture and think about history. Turns out no one's doing what they're doing in a way that's really for them. It's all organized by someone else's interests. And that's, for Cabral, the basic relation that capitalism sets up, and it's a colonial one. And so if that's the starting point, I think there's another way to think about what it is to be working class that isn't about wages. You could think of working class as the class of people who preserve their material security, whether they're going to eat, whether or not they're going to have shelter, etc. Though the working class are those people who work for that end. And then capitalists are people who don't, because other people do that work. So an advantage of thinking about it the way I'm proposing is my way of figuring out who's working class and who's not focuses on what work is for, rather than what work is for, what it accomplishes, rather than the form of work. So mine applies equally well to enslaved people who certainly are doing the work that they're doing in order to stay alive and to preserve themselves and to preserve their families. And it also applies to waged workers. And it gives us a framework for figuring out more distinctions from there. So there's different levels of security. Maybe you are sure that you can make rent, but you aren't sure whether you're going to afford childcare, which is different from someone who's in the opposite situation. And other kinds of analyses people have proposed for what classes there are would fit comfortably into that. There's this guy, Guy Standing, an economist, who suggests that we might think of people who get paid on salary as different from people in what we would call the gig economy now, or Uberized, really precarious, really insecure work. And we would have some more stuff to say there. Some disadvantages. It's a less clear-cut distinction than, the one you would get if you stuck with Marx's analysis. So, it's easy to say whether or not you trade trade hours of your life for dollars. That's a clear-cut, you do that or you don't. Whereas if you're working for security, then we have to deal with all these thorny questions like, what kind of security, how much security, et cetera, et cetera. And so you might not like that. But, I probably should have ended on advantages rather than disadvantages. But I think my idea might work anyway, but thank you.
And now, could you please get to your side of James Boggs stuff?
Okay, well, I'm really honored to be here. It's wonderful to be on this panel, so thank you all for coming out. Little surprised I'm speaking about James Boggs today, but happy to try to address maybe some of the things that Chris Stinson might have talked about, but I'm certainly not deeply aware of the specific research he's doing. So I'm going to talk about what I know about James Boggs, but I'm also, I guess I would have not seen myself as someone even talking about James Boggs on my own, because 20 years ago, I really didn't know who he was. So how many people in this room know who James Boggs is? So half the room. So have you heard of Grace Lee Boggs? Okay, so I got to know about James Boggs really by working really closely with his comrades in Detroit. I lived in Detroit for about 14 years, and I worked very closely with Grace Lee Boggs for the last 17 years of her life. So James Boggs passed away 25 years ago, so this July will actually be the 25th anniversary of his passing. And like I said, it was 20 years ago when I met his longtime life partner and political partner, Grace Lee Boggs. And James Boggs was African American, and Grace Lee Boggs was Chinese American. So they were known really by the fact that they were a biracial couple at a time when that was not so common. But James Boggs was actually much more known than Grace Lee Boggs in his lifetime. James had gone from, or Jimmy as she called him, had gone from being, someone who grew up in the rural Jim Crow South, became an auto worker, and then by the time the era of the 60s and the Black Power movement, he was engaged in theoretical writings and movement organizing that was reaching thousands of people. He was in conversations with some of the most prominent philosophers in the world. So he'd gone from this very humble position in life to take on this very, very prominent position. And so Grace Lee Boggs, to a lot of people, was James Boggs' wife. This was a time when obviously the gender relations even within the movement were not where they should have been. The irony is that I think today many people know James Boggs more as the husband of Grace Lee Boggs, because in the time I knew her, we did a book together. There was a documentary that came out about her. She began to assume a much bigger stature. The Women's March, with the millions of people, named her as one of the sheroes or heroines and inspired them. And to think about this now, anybody seen the movie Barry, which was on Netflix? So it's the story of Barack Obama when he was a college student. And he's confused. Does he belong with the white people at Columbia University and the Ivy League elite? Does he belong with the black folks, the barbershop who he's playing basketball with? And spoiler alert, he becomes president. But before you get to that part, at the end of the movie, if you don't want to know the end of the movie, don't listen. He resolves this identity crisis, right? Between racial divides, and is he going to be a political person? Is he going to be just a studious, Columbia elite grad and go to work on Wall Street? He resolves this identity crisis when he gets introduced to James and Grace Lee Boggs. And they become his role models. It's all fictional. But they become his role models to say that you don't have to be, you don't have to be confused about who you are. You're American just like us, and we come out of the civil rights and Black Power movement. So he decides that, again, he can go on with the rest of his life. It's an incredible thing to watch. These actors, Hollywood actors, playing James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs, and becoming the mentors to the, Barack Obama. But it's amazing how this life journey starts and moves in very unexpected places, and very unexpected to me too, because again, I didn't think I would ever be a professor. I certainly didn't think I would be talking about, James and Grace Lee Boggs. Or now I'm basically in Grace's will. I was named as one of the people to carry on, their papers, their legacy, and so on. And I think there's no doubt that if James Boggs were here today, he would be talking about the massacre of Palestinians. He would be talking about the massacre of high school students in Texas. And he would be talking, obviously, about this tremendous crisis we're in with what's going on in Washington, D.C. And the country. And I think what he would be doing is helping us to say that while he talks so much of his life about the class struggle from the perspective of a Chrysler auto worker, that the class struggle for him was part of the struggle to expand our humanity. That what was happening to him and other workers was a part of how capitalism had created so much, not just exploitation that needed to be overcome, but dehumanization. He'd said that a lot. That what's happening is making us less and less of a human being every day. So I'm going to talk about how his ideas of radicalism evolved over time. And what I want to stress is something he said was that he had the audacity, or as Grace would say, he had the audacity to think that his job was to do for the 20th century what Marx did in the 19th century. That we could learn a lot from Marx, and we still are learning from Marx, but that we live in different conditions. We lived in different conditions in the 20th century, and now we live in different conditions today. And so what we want to learn from James Boggs is not that everything he said applies to today, but his way of thinking dialectically, the way of analyzing conditions and responding to new conditions and developing new ideas is what really matters, right? And so what I'm going to do is talk about how James Boggs was an organic intellectual, and how every idea he developed, every theory, every principle for movement organizing really grew out of his involvement in the struggle and out of his own involvement in the black community, coming to the South and moving into Detroit. So he was born in Marion Junction, Alabama, again, during the era of Jim Crow, during the era of sharecropping. Like many people, followed the Great Migration. He rode the rails, ended up in Detroit, became a Chrysler worker, was a fellow traveler of the Communist Party in the 1930s. And as he was a worker, he came across the Johnson Forest tendency, which was started by C.L.R. James, Mariah Dinevskaya, and Grace Lee at that time was working very closely with them. And they were anti-Stalinists. Some of them were really, Dinevskaya was a core Trotskyist. But for the Boggses, it was really more the anti-Stalinism, or maybe not even anti-Stalin, just the fact that they were challenging basic ideas even within the left. And one of the things that the Johnson Forest movement really stressed was the idea of third layer schools, what they drew from Lenin. Lenin talked about the three layers of society. I think it's the party, the union, and the workers, or so on. And he was moving from the party to the grassroots. And the idea of third layer schools was that the grassroots rank and file workers should be the teachers of a school for basically the party leaders to learn from. So James Boggs emerged as one of the very articulate spokespeople for this group of workers that the Johnson Forest was trying to organize. But there's an interesting thing happening, that they all go to Detroit thinking that this is the center of the industrial proletariat. And what James Boggs starts telling them is that we're being hit by automation, we're being hit by basically the attempt by the capitalists to shrink the working class, and obviously we know increasing outsourced production to other places. So all of this discussion of casualization and outsourcing and moving towards all these ways we think about precarity today were things James Boggs started to notice even in the 1950s at the heart of industrial capitalism in Motown. Right? And so eventually he wrote a book called American Revolution, Notes from Negro Workers Notebook, pages from Negro Workers Notebook. And he talked, as Charisse was talking about, how automation was creating a class of outsiders, that the revolutionary forces wouldn't necessarily be the workers in the most developed sectors, that they would increasingly be African Americans. He basically talked about at the dawn of the Black Power movement, right? Civil rights is transforming for many in the North into the Black Power movement. He's talking about how these other social forces that can't be defined solely by orthodox ideas of the proletariat are really becoming the revolutionary forces. And as Grace would say, he was very observant that we had moved from a shift from agriculture to industry, which he had experienced going from the South to Detroit, but that we were now moving from industry to post-industry, or whatever we want to talk about today, the neoliberal phase, or information capitalism, and so on. And that we needed to think about the social forces of revolution in a new way. And that was really the basis of his first book, American Revolution. It's kind of launched him onto this bigger stage. So that's in the early 60s. And he starts talking about Black Power because of this, even before there is a Black Power movement. He starts talking largely about Black Power in terms of political power in cities like Detroit. And the next book, which I think was going to be really the source of a lot of what Chris was going to talk about, is called Racism and the Class Struggle. And he's really it's really an argument in many ways with the left, right? That the traditional left social forces, like we talk about, an orthodox idea of the working class, the labor unions or the trade unions, he was involved in the UAW. He's really pointing out that the racism of the UAW and some of the labor movement is so entrenched at that point, and the bureaucracy is so entrenched, that they've become part of, in many ways, the industrial capitalist order, which now needs to be challenged and transcended. And of course, Detroit becomes a real center point of the Black Power movement. The Boggses are doing their organizing, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, there's a Black Panther Party chapter, there's a lot going on. And again, it's an argument not just against capitalism, but against the old left and against the white left, right, that they're putting forward. And in this context, again, they're putting forward new ideas to think about the role of, black workers and the Black Power movement in the anti-capitalist revolution. And then, of course, the Detroit Rebellion hits in '67, right? And this, in many ways, had been what they were pushing for so many years, this uprising against the existing system. But in the aftermath of the rebellion, the Boggses realized that rebellion was not revolution. Right? That you can have people very angry at the system, you can have people rebelling against the system, and that would not necessarily bring about a new system. In fact, the rebellions triggered all kinds of counter-revolutionary activity, which of course we're still living today. I mean, everything that ICE and Trump and Jeff Sessions and all these people are doing today is a continuation of that counter-revolution. The other thing they saw in the aftermath of the rebellions and the Black Power movement was that many people from the movement were being co-opted into the system. I mean, Detroit itself becomes basically, on a local basis at least, governed by a black elite. And so increasingly, they see themselves, again, seeking to go beyond the rebellious aspects of the 60s and beyond the sort of co-optation or incorporation of 60s movement activists into the system. And that's where this is really the last book James Boggs wrote. They did it jointly called Revolution, Evolution in the 20th Century. And what they really do was try to go through the lessons of revolutionary movements in the 20th century, including Cabral and the movement in Guinea-Bissau, and try to understand, again, what were the ways in which we could both learn what happened at those moments, but how we can apply those lessons not as some timeless truths, but as awakenings to help us understand the current moment. And as Detroit increasingly became hit by deindustrialization, by white flight, by downsizing, increasingly what the Boggses were talking about, again, was not the role of the UAW in bringing about, a living wage for workers or, allowing workers to have vacations and benefits, because those jobs were disappearing. It wasn't about how having black mayors was going to represent a great advance, because by that time Coleman Young was entrenched in power 20 years. He actually at one point destroys an entire neighborhood in Detroit to give it away for free to GM, because GM said, we won't build our next factory in Detroit. We can build it anywhere in the world at this point. We'll build it here only if you give us all the land for free, take it all by eminent domain, and give us something like, $100-something million in subsidies on top of that. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds really familiar.
And so it's really in this context, right, of seeing that the rebellions of the 60s did not go far enough, we need to go beyond rebellion. Of seeing that just diversifying corporate America, diversifying, the mayors and the Congress people was not sufficient. And seeing that the challenges facing Detroit in the era of schools closing down and the drug wars and the violence really made them recognize that, again, we had to be building an alternative to capitalism from the ground up, that we could not wait for some party to take power and then come up with some new solutions, as Lenin was trying to do in the last years of his life. But that what we really need to do was, and these terms get used in all kinds of ways, that we needed to prefigure a new social order, that people who in autonomous Marxist ways of thinking have thought a lot about this, horizontalist movements coming out of Latin America that had influence here. The Boggses use the term dialectical humanism. Right? So I'm going to just stop there. If people are interested in learning more about this, I'm going to talk more about this as I was scheduled to do next Saturday. I wrote a book about how this kind of takes root in Detroit called The 50-Year Rebellion, going from the 67 to the current neoliberal state takeover and bankruptcy in Detroit. And if people are interested, there are some free copies of the magazine that comes out of the Boggs Center in Detroit and has writings by activists and organizers about the struggle in Detroit called Riverwise. There's some sample copies back there. But I'm just going to stop there, and if people want to talk more about it, happy to do that.
So we're going to divide the question period in two parts. Wally will ask a number of questions to the panel to start the discussion, and then after a certain point, we'll take it out to the audience. I just want to say one thing that I forgot, which is we've started our GoFundMe last night, and so please go to our website and go online, reach into your pockets, and give whatever you can so we can continue this wonderful festival and bring people like Charisse and Femi here to Seattle and use the native talents of Scott and Wale.
So I just want to say one thing about Q&A that I always say at academic panels is that this is Q&A, not U&A. So let's share the intellectual space. Please keep your questions to questions and keep them short and concise so that as many people as possible can contribute to the intellectual comments. And we'll likewise try to keep our answers short and concise. So thank you.
And just as Scott did not expect to inherit the Boggs collection, I did not expect to be sitting here today. So, let's go. Let's have some fun. So, I do have questions though. You had mentioned, Scott, that James Boggs had talked about really challenging the left. And I want to know from all of you, like, what parts of the left are you excited to challenge? And how would you challenge, and then also, how would you challenge the black population of the United States and perhaps beyond to move more leftward?
So I think that these things are dialectical, right? The 1930s was perhaps like the 1930s and perhaps the 1960s were sort of the apotheosis of radicalism. The 1930s because of the collapse of capitalism and the belief that an alternative was necessary, and perhaps the 1960s because of the kind of conjuncture of decolonization, the insurgency for rights in the United States, and sort of a global anti-imperialist trend, and the belief that another world was possible. And so I think that what the work of people like Gerald Horne show us is that Black people have been most powerful when international coalitions are built, that historically, right, whether it's, Blacks aligning with the British during the War of 1812, or Blacks aligning with the Japanese prior to World War II, or, Blacks advocating third worldism, in terms of creating a much larger cartography for the understanding of struggle. I think that that's what's sort of missing from forms of activism today. I think that there are aspects of that happening, such as, Black Lives Matter kind of correspondence with Palestinian activists on the ground, but I think that it's not as organized and systematic as it has been in previously. For instance, part of the success of like the Scottsboro case of 1931 was the systematic sort of organization, mass mobilization, and internationalization of that particular case. And so that's one aspect that's missing, and perhaps one way to reignite sort of a move leftward. The second thing too is that we have to take into account massive repression, and so that's why I study anti-radicalism, because there was, during the height of the Cold War, there's sort of this Procrustean dilemma, right? So we know Procrustes, right? So on the one hand, you can continue on a radical sort of leftist path and be crushed, or you can kind of turn inward and turn towards nationalism, and turn towards sort of more narrow demands for civil rights, and get some concessions, and get sort of at least a nominal end to Jim Crow. And so we haven't really recovered from that. And the security state has only become more entrenched, it has become more ubiquitous, and we're in fact interpolating ourselves into it, right? So I call that dry snitching, but that's neither here nor there. So I think that, I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think that all of these things need to be taken into account. We need to come up with forms of organization and sort of mobilization that are responsive to our times, right? We can't look to the 1960s. We're in a fundamentally different historical moment. So understanding like what our social relations are and how to navigate those things clandestinely, but also in a mass and sort of organized fashion.
I co-sign that. All right, I have one thing to say. Just like one addition is, so some of the promising stuff that's happening is people paying attention to what's happening in Palestine, but also, just talking about black people specifically for 1 second, like Blackness itself was more international in the times Charisse is talking about, right? So this was the time of a lot of anti-colonial activity on the continent and in the Caribbean, right? Throughout the diaspora, and black folk here, saw themselves as having something to do with that, and vice versa. And so I think that would be a good, thing to bring back.
A couple things. So in this book, Revolution, Evolution, the 20th Century, the Boggs has said something that at the time was actually quite controversial. They said, if we're going to have a socialist revolution in America, it'll be the first revolution where we demand less rather than more. And we think, how could that be? Like, workers are being exploited, the capitalists are getting so much of the profits. But what they were pointing is, a revolution can't just be about redistributing the profits from an empire that's sucking resources and taking life, right, away from the rest of the world. And so it was really about recognizing that if we're going to have a revolution in this country, it's going to be about American imperialism, right? Reckoning with American imperialism and the way it's destroyed. He was even then talking about the destruction of really our natural resources in the planet back then at a very early time, right? Before we knew about the climate crisis. And I think about that a lot because I moved from Detroit to Seattle about 4 years ago, right? And they're such different cities. In some ways, you have this massive gentrification happening in both places. But Seattle has the 2 richest people in the world. There is a tremendous amount of wealth here. And it's logical that people are demanding a share of that wealth. If you work for Amazon, if you work for Microsoft, $15 minimum wage, and these have set standards for other parts of the country in many ways. But it doesn't necessarily deal with the types of crises that are happening in Detroit, where the problem is not that people don't make enough wages. The problem is that they've destroyed the public school system entirely. About half of the population is structurally unemployed, right? And this is like what investment looks like. So there's a Marathon oil plant that expanded. They got $175 million in subsidies from the city. It's about 10, 15 years ago. Because they wanted to expand their capacity so they can refine Canadian tar sands. Right? The dirtiest, crap imaginable. And for that $175 million subsidy, they added like 14 jobs for Detroiters. Meanwhile, this pollution is spread over like this entire, not just neighborhood, section of Southwest Detroit, and making the whole area surrounding it unlivable, particularly where black people and people of color, working class people live, right? So that's what it looks like. You had, Betsy DeVos and her friends raided the entire public school system in Detroit. 200 schools closed in 15 years. Michigan has $1 billion a year charter school industry, 80% of which is for profits. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the country. And if you want to know what the Amazon proposal was for Detroit, or what Michigan came up with for Detroit, they were going to let Amazon not just get all these subsidies, they were going to let them keep all of the income tax on the workers, all the property tax paid by any tenants, in the buildings. And basically, it's like this little fiefdom. They actually collect the taxes. not even that they pay it to the government and they get some subsidies back, they actually just keep the taxes. And Dan Gilbert, the billionaire that owns the Cleveland Cavaliers and has bought up over 100 buildings in Detroit, he's basically pushing those same arrangements for himself. So even at Amazon's not going to get them. It's going to go to these other capitalists. I mean, literally, this is not even a bad form of capitalism. This is a new form. Maybe it's an old form of feudalism. But it's a new form of authoritarian, neoliberal capitalism on steroids, right? And that's the model. So what we're fighting here is atrocious, right? But what they're doing in Detroit is breaking the mold and trying to create, again, as Emmanuel Wallerstein pointed out to me, capitalism is not the worst system in the world. So when capitalism is in crisis, that also means there's people trying to create something more oppressive, more exploitative, more racist and authoritarian than what we have now.
Indeed.
I'll get you there.
Oh, indeed. That we are at an inflection point in terms of society. We have late capitalism, and we have a decision to make as a society whether we go into a better situation, socialism, or not so good, like some sort of neo-feudalism. And so, could you talk more, Scott, about the differences between Detroit versus Seattle? I mean, if you look at the demographics of Seattle in terms of its black population versus Detroit being 80% black, Seattle is, I think it might be like under 10% black. In any case, that's a question for you.
Okay, well, I'll just try to be brief. So again, Detroit has about 1/3 of its land, which is vacant. It had 140,000 foreclosures at the peak of the housing crisis. And it's basically, being made so that the city is just unlivable and unsustainable for hundreds of thousands of people, the majority of which are black and poor. And I think what's important to look about when you look at the resistance, right, is that, and you can cite your favorite theorists to sustain, what it means beyond Detroit. But what I'm talking about is if we're using the term socialism or something anti-capitalist, it's not about redistributing the wealth that's there. It's about creating an alternative. In many ways, people talked about, can China skip the stage of capitalism, go from feudalism to socialism? In Detroit, it's really talking about skipping the stage of state socialism and going from capitalism to small c communism. And that is really the spirit behind many of the movements in Detroit. So the urban farming movement cuts across a lot of different, political tendencies, but it's in many ways about creating, a subsistence economy, a collective form of economics, solidarity economics. It's not about redistributing GM's wealth, but about, again, creating, the basic. People are using 3D printers, digital fabrication technology to try to talk about owning the means of production rather than getting a share, of the wealth created by capitalism. People are reinventing schools so that the freedom school model comes out of the movement, really is the basis for a whole new school system. The type of work people do, against police brutality is not just about, getting civilian review boards, although those are important. It's about creating community-based models of transformative justice. So I think that's what's really important when you look at the movements coming out of Detroit. It's about, again, creating those alternatives while we are resisting, the power being imposed on us.
That's rather excellent. Model the future. And so in terms of the future, let's talk about the future in terms of economic models on a more microeconomic basis. So Richard, the Marxist economist Richard Wolff has spoken about the value of cooperatives, meaning employee-owned companies and where it's not just some manager or some capitalist, getting all the profits, but it's evenly distributed amongst the employees. What sort of potential is there for Black communities to take part in this, like from your perspective, if you have a take on this? Let's have 2 people answer.
Well, how about this? Sorry, I'm gonna overtake this thing. Let's hold that question, and then why don't we take like a batch of audience questions and then respond to all of them, just so we can, it's not just us running our mouths up here. No, that's great.
So, anybody in the audience who has a question, please line up over here so we can get you on mic. Then, you can all line up while one person is talking. And then we'll take a couple and then
So thank you for a really exciting panel. So first, comment on the Rick Wolf issue. Truth in Advertising, Rick was on my committee. I want to note that there was a study done about the racial composition of the solidarity economy and cooperative movement in Philadelphia. And I'm happy to share that reference with folks who haven't. The answer is that it's horrendously white. So with that in mind, I actually have a question that goes back to the transnational character of these movements as essential for bringing back, in some sense, the visibility and strength of Black presence in these alternate movements. So the question really had to do with whether you see, for all of you, but especially for Charisse and Femi, do you see any link between the effort to create these alternate forms of economic resistance, which seems very micro level, and these almost transnational level scales that you note are necessary for resistance? And similarly, in your case, there is something quite transnational about trying to reconceptualize the working class in order to encapsulate something that goes beyond a micro level. So I'm just trying to see what the connection is in your minds between those 2 scales.
Let's take another 2 questions quickly. And then make sure that your mic is near you, and look at my hands. If you're not thinking loud enough, I'll signal.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I'm curious what you all think of the Jackson Kush plan and what's happening in Jackson. And I also just want to name for folks in Seattle that one of the organizers here who has similar politics to the Jackson Kush plan, Omari Tahir Garrett, has been facing a lot of repression and displacement. And I just got an email from his defense committee today that said that a conglomerate of landlord companies, an international conglomerate, just filed to release the court ruling around his case and publish it more broadly. Basically, what the implication of that is that landlords can remove a rebellious tenant who speaks out against them, not just from that building, but the whole block. They banned him from 23rd and Union, the whole block in the Central District. So that would probably spread to other anti-gentrification struggles across the city or really around the world, possibly in other cities as well. I just wanted to name that and get that out there. Something to look out for, Omari Tahir Garrett versus Midtown Properties. Thank you.
One more and then we'll go. Let's take this out here and kind of lift it up.
Yeah, first of all, let me say it's a fantastic panel, and I really enjoyed what all of you had to say. I just wanted to share some thoughts about the original question that you raised, because I've been struggling with it myself. So here's the thing. When you say, how do you make Black struggles, more, I forget exactly how you put it, but, more radical, I think you said. I think that perhaps we are making a mistake of sorts, because I think that historically, radical movements have gone farthest when they have taken existing struggles, whatever they are. They may appear to be not very radical, but whatever daily problems and that people are struggling about, whether it's rent, housing, wages, or even immigration issues, whatever it is, you've got to begin there and take it from there. Because it seems to me that when we say that, struggles today are not as radical as perhaps they were in the 60s, we're kind of imposing an external judgment on them, an external structure on them, which may not be very relevant. Because I would say that in the 60s, radicals didn't go around saying, well, why are black people talking about black liberation rather than the liberation of the international working class? They just supported black liberation movements, civil rights movements, in whatever form. They didn't say to the civil rights movement people, oh, you're not sufficiently radical because you're struggling for liberal rights rather than socialist rights, and therefore we're not going to support you. They didn't say that. That's what gave strength to those movements. And I think when we, otherwise, I remember thinking about this because, talking to somebody who kept talking about how she had to raise the consciousness of various people. And I said, well, who are we? Existing struggles reflect the existing situation in an objective way. And that's what we have to perhaps try and understand. Just a thought.
Okay, so just to respond quickly to the last point, I think that that's a good point. I think that the larger argument that I was making about the 1930s and the 1960s was the confluence of events, that when there are massive amounts of people moving in a particular direction, right, that creates the conditions for insurgency on the one hand, but also the forcing of concessions. I don't think that we're in that moment. Right, and it's not just going to come along. We have to create the conditions for that. But I think that that's what accounts for the quote-unquote or the different form in which radicalism or leftism. I don't even know what the fuck that means in the U.S. context, but like the different form that politics are taking currently. So people should do whatever they want. In terms of, so I think that the dialectic or the relationship between local sustenance and local sort of resistance on the one hand, and in placing that in a larger global analysis or larger understanding is probably the best approach, right? So it's been referred to as like localization or whatever, in many other ways. It's because in the final analysis, there are we gotta hold the line on the local level. There are day-to-day exigencies that need to be accounted for, right? But at the same time, I think there's a way to link what's happening in Detroit with what's happening in, spaces in the Caribbean, what's happening in Venezuela, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Burundi, what's happening all over the world. And, again, like expanding that cartography to get not only the vocabulary, but also to build solidarity and to build alliances, however transient or however temporary, just to exert that pressure, because it's the pressure that has historically been exerted on governments to extract concessions pending revolution, right? Because there are day-to-day realities that we have to contend with on the local level. But I think knowing what's going on in the world, I just feel like we know so little about what's going on because of U.S. media imperialism, because of a whole host of things. But I think just staying attuned to that and thinking about how are my conditions or the conditions of my community linked to many of these larger struggles, right? And how do we build solidarity across? So that's all I got.
So to respond to the first two questions, the first question was about what the connection is between the kind of autonomous movements there are and reconceptualizing the working class and transnationalism. And then the second question was about Jackson Push, right? And I think there's a connection to them because jumping off what Charisse was just saying, we know little about the rest of the world, but it's also kind of striking what it is that we know about the rest of the world. So just think about, the point Boggs makes, right, about how what we know about the rest of the world is that that's where our jobs are going, our jobs, right? People know where their bread is buttered, right, at the end of the day. And if the relationship that people are asked to have by capital to people who should be their comrades overseas is this competition, then, it's hard to see how we're going to get, radical transnationalism. On the other hand, if you have the kind of thing that's going on in Jackson, right? If people are finding ways to create relationships based on solidarity rather than competition with each other, I think that, even though that's on a local scale, I think what that opens up is, well, when I don't depend on what the GE plan is doing to know, how I'm going to sustain myself, then it opens up a way of relating to people I don't see in front of me that isn't as people who could potentially steal my job or people who, people who I should be afraid of, or et cetera, et cetera. I think, it's a much better basis. It changes the material relationship that you see between yourself and other people, and that's a better place to start for consciousness raising than, pamphlets.
Briefly, I was going to moderate, and so Dean Spade asked me to give a shout out to the campaign against the youth jail. So I promise I'm not moderating. And Dean wanted me to just check out their face page for more information about that. And I just want to clarify, we were talking about Jackson, Mississippi, right? Yeah. That has roots in Detroit too, right? I mean, the Henry brothers were founders of the Republic of New Africa. They had worked very closely with the Boggses. Chokwe Lumumba comes out of the Republic of New Africa and then moves to Jackson. And in many ways, it's a continuation of a response to the crisis that the Boggses and the other Black Power movement activists saw in the 60s, which was that, again, the problem was not just that GM was making more profits that weren't all going to the workers or weren't even all going to black workers, within the UAW, but that this whole system was unsustainable, that it was a crisis of humanity, that it basically, it needed to, there needed to be a model of an alternative, right? So the Boggses kept working on it in Detroit, Republic of New Africa folks moved down to the south, took originally more of a rural approach and then moving in cities. I think that's really important because it's showing that so many people right now are thinking, well, if the Democrats can just get back the House and the Senate, then we'll be out of this crisis moment. But the reality is that may be a necessary step to fend off some of the worst catastrophes, I mean, when we see what's happening, again, Palestine, Texas, DC. But I think what's really important is the recognition that these political forms of organizing go hand in hand with these, new economic arrangements, right? And we see what happened in Detroit as the converse to that. That in order to get this new model of neoliberalism on steroids, where billionaires could basically own the whole downtown area and cut off services and schools to the rest of the city, they had to displace even the black elite political class that, with all its contradictions, was still seen as an obstacle to these billionaires coming and taking office. As you know, they suspended the entire city government for a year and a half. It's still under receivership, basically. But for a year and a half, one corporate bankruptcy attorney had control of every decision for the entire city, not just the finances, the police department, the fire department, the parks, selling off land, he could veto any decision the city council made. One guy, appointed by the Republican governor from a corporate law firm, Jones Day. And he was black.
The next.
So my question is about, I guess I was really intrigued by what you were saying about Detroit. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is sort of Seattle's culture of philanthropy and how deep that seems to run. And maybe because they're the two richest people in Seattle, but also because of just kind of how deep the effect of having the Bill and Melinda Gates foundations just really affecting so much of the city, and the Gates Foundation basically pays for my job and my salary, and so and then also thinking about the history of sort of grassroots radical movements in Seattle, which have gotten co-opted and institutionalized and sort of professionalized, and the communities that suffer the most from that are our communities that are already marginalized. My question is about, in your point of view, how the left in Seattle can sort of like push on that idea of like redistribution and start creating more of those movements that create those alternatives or build power in communities rather than having the conversation centered around redistribution and really centered on like those two richest people ever. So.
So I really appreciated, Olufemi, your formulation of class and what the working class is. And I think for me, what I was really thinking about as you articulated kind of those like three different formulations was like, what is the limit to struggle that each of those poses? And so in terms of your new formulation of what constitutes a worker, what constitutes the working class, and what constitutes the capitalist class, what openings in terms of struggle do you see for that formulation?
I love that question. I have a preface, 3 questions, and a comment. So the preface is that this was wonderful, and I feel really grateful for all the talks because I feel like I learned just a whole bunch. Okay, so that's the preface. The first question is for Charisse. I loved your presentation. I'm completely persuaded. I thought it was great. And so my question is essentially kind of like going off script, right? Going further from it. And I was wondering if you thought that there were ways that in the present, that the present is in the last 20, 30 years, that the ascription of a kind of radicality to blackness becomes transformed into a liberal co-optation that's saying anything that black voters choose is necessarily progressive. So is there a way that it gets distorted or twisted in the liberal co-optation of black voters? So that's the question for you. On the question for the reconfiguration of working class, totally exciting. My question is, okay, so if I understood you correctly, you want to say that working class refers to those who have to produce the conditions for survival rather than sell their labor power. And so my first question is, how's that different from peasants? And is there, could there just be like it's an old school version of peasants? And I don't have a dog in the fight, I'm just curious. And the next one is, how does this let us think about particularly women's unpaid domestic labor? Because I'm a little worried about something that's going to make white bourgeois women into a working class in the same way that really proletarianized workers are. So I'm kind of curious about how you're going to navigate women's unpaid labor. Then the last question, I don't know a ton about James Boggs. I started reading more, particularly because y'all were doing this. And so, but the stuff I was reading, and I don't know the periodization, was some really exciting accounts of a party form and a defense of a militant and disciplined party. And I didn't hear you saying anything about that. I heard a kind of like fluffy horizontalism. And so I'm wondering, does he like not remain committed to a disciplined party, or are these the same? And can you say something about that? And then, so those are my 3 questions. My last point is, I guess maybe more of a statement or a commentary. I don't think that what happened in Texas is the same thing as Gaza or Palestine. And I'm wondering if it makes sense to separate those or why it might be the same, but I think they're really different.
Some great questions there. So let's hear it from our speakers.
I think we'll just take these and then we'll end.
Bring us home.
All right. So let me deal with the second question of that set first. So about the limits of organizing and opportunities for the new formulation of working class. So the new formulation of working class is the people who do work for their material security, rent, housing, et cetera, those are the working class, and the people who don't aren't. I think, so one kind of limit from a political perspective is, there's a danger of co-optation. I think like I'm basically describing the framework that shows like how the middle class was bought off during the right to work era, and shows how we could be in the future, right? Because if the main struggle of people in the working class, as I'm describing it, is trying to get security, well then, maybe we could be depoliticized by just giving us security. So if the state, pinky swears that they're gonna redistribute enough of the spoils of empire to us as individuals, and then maybe, yeah. But I think it shows us what's important about a thing like Jackson, right? If we have solidaristic ways of making ourselves secure and trying to build out a system that does that in a non-parasitic way, I think that's the target. And this sounds more and more Boggsian, but I don't know. I got to think about he's good. Yeah, I got to think about that. And to the third question about. So there were two parts. So one, how are working class people different from peasants on this description? I'm not sure that they are. They might not be. And maybe that challenges how I have been thinking about feudalism as different from capitalism. I definitely have to think about that. But I don't think. I think if we have a good enough kind of collective version of what people are doing when they work, I think we can avoid the kind of white bourgeois women becoming, part of the working class as I'm defining it here. Because if you think of like a household as a social unit, that household isn't working in order to preserve it. In order to preserve itself. There's work being done by people in the household, but they would survive even if there isn't, if you're rich and you're wealthy and you own the means of production. And often they don't. They hire other people to do at least some of the domestic labor, not all of it. That would be different from the domestic situation of you have maybe a two-partner household, and one partner does work in the formal economy and one partner does domestic labor. Like together, their work combines to like make this house survive. And I think kind of the sort of Federici type characterizations of reproductive labor, I think, push in this direction as well. Like, you can only do 12 hours of wage labor if you assume that the other labor that has to happen so that everybody makes it is going to happen, right? And so that work together interfaces with the whole family surviving. So whether it's kids' labor or spouses' labor, yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the question, so your question was essentially, is there a way in which liberals co-opt this notion of blackness as inherently progressive? This is bullshit. Nobody is objectively progressive or radical or leftist. I don't care how oppressed you are. Like, I don't care if you're like black, woman, wheelchair, queer, ashy, fucking whatever. That does not make you objectively radical, right? And I think that this is part of the risk of particular forms of identity politics, right? And so many of my students talk about how just being is political. No, it's not. Or everything is political. So I asked them, like, a roast beef sandwich is political? And they're like, no. So it's like, everything can be politicized, right? Which requires an interrogation of social relations. But to say that everything is inherent, or a body or a thing is inherently political, evades any further analysis. You just are, right? And so, you know, it's just bad faith, right? I don't think that there's anything, just as, you know, Scott was just pointing out, this man who is running Detroit is a black man, right? This lawyer, this corporate lawyer. There's nothing progressive about it. And I think that what's pernicious about the constitution of blackness as always already radical or insurgent, number one, lends to what I was talking about earlier about blackness as always threat. But on the other hand, it lets so much off the hook, right? So the critique that we have of Barack Obama, who is odious, sorry, but he is, right, looks differently because of histories of racism and anti-blackness, right? Or we are like, oh, Jay-Z, he got the blueprint for liberation. It's like, no, he doesn't, right? And so there's a way in which we inscribe a particular type of progressivism or radicalism in blackness that allows people to evade responsibility for doing like real work, so.
Last words?
So I'll try to address all these points as quick as I can. So I hope it was clear when I was bringing up Texas and Palestine, not that they were the same thing, but that the reason James Boggs would speak out against both of them is because they are actually quite different phenomenon. And for him, as someone thinking dialectically and understanding the crisis we're facing, is that we have to actually understand the multi-dimensions in which this crisis is occurring. But that also we can't separate ourselves from the damage that's being done in our name in other places around the world, no matter what our race or class or gender, sexuality is. It is true, though, that most of his life, James Boggs was committed to building a vanguard revolutionary party. Even when they're writing this book, which in many ways is challenging conventional ideas of Marxism-Leninism, they're writing within the Marxist-Leninist tradition. They're trying to sort of save Leninism from the Leninists. Or as Marx once said, you know, I'm not a Marxist, supposedly, right? This week, Marxist. In some ways, they're talking about a view of Leninism that most people who call themselves Leninists would not necessarily have ascribed to. At that time, the time when everyone who was like between the age of 20 and 35 and coming out of the new left is trying to build a party, right, in the 1970s. They're basically responding to that, but still within the language of Marxist-Lenin, because that's what everyone was using at the time. And it's only later on, as the crisis in Detroit, the economic crisis, political crisis gets deeper, that they start using different language. They start using language like change yourself to change the world, different ways of thinking. And it's really more in Grace's lifetime after Jimmy dies that she starts critiquing some of the both cultural and political tendencies inherent in vanguardism more explicitly. Last couple of things I just want to say. Where do we go from here, right? Or as Lenin would say, when he was Lenin, what is to be done? I think we really need to think about the importance of decommodification. And I'm not the one that came up with this, you know. So again, in Detroit, there are so many neighborhoods, right, where capitalism is like, we don't give a shit. Like, the average value of vacant lots in many of these places is still like $100 or $300, right? It's only in certain areas that the gentrifiers have come in and jacked up rents. There are still in many places no retail stores, no grocery stores, which is why the urban farming movement wasn't just about cleaning up vacant lots, it was about using those spaces where, you know, capitalism was not so interested for a while, right? In creating a decommodified economy, right, based on non-commercial relationships. It was an opportunity to do that, particularly for young people growing up in those areas. Seattle, of course, is the exact opposite. Like, you can pull up your phone, and I have an iPhone, I admit it, like, and get any consumer commodity you want delivered to your door in like 10 minutes, right? And like, that's what neoliberalism is about commodifying everything. Oh, it's like we didn't find a way to make money off of people dating. Well, let's create an app for that. Oh, we didn't find a way for people to have like more, you know, adventurous, like non-vanilla sexual proclivities. So let's create an app for that. Oh, but that's more, you know, for cisgender, you know, heteronormative couples. Well, let's create an app for the people who are, you know, queer. I mean, it's like there's an app for everything, every feeling, every emotion. You've got a car you're not using, you know, 12 hours a day. Let's create an app to make money off of that. There's a spare bedroom in your house. Let's create an app to make money off of that. Like all these things that we thought were just part of our lives that like weren't subjected to capitalist market forces on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis are now part of this gig app neoliberal economy. And Detroit, because capitalism is still, again, abandoned some of the city, creates that space for people to think about alternatives in ways. In Seattle, it's just like so much has already been commodified. We are having to resist this intense commodification. The difference is we still have more political democracy in this city than Detroit has, right? Because of the way these things have developed. And I think that's the last point to make, that these things are happening because the system is in crisis. The system is in transition to an uncertain next phase. One that could be better if we win, and one that could be much worse if the other side wins, right? And there's no guarantee, you know, who's gonna line up on what side, who's gonna win. We don't even have a fixed sense of what winning looks like. But again, in that uncertainty, in that sense of uncertainty, is a sense of hope, is a challenge, and is a mandate that we think creatively, right? Creatively, both imaginatively and creatively in terms of generatively, creating alternatives, right? And that's why I think, to me, as bad as this shit is right now, and it's as bad as it's ever been in my lifetime, there's also much more hope for change than any time in my lifetime too.